I'm Kaylee, and today I'm talking about Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. The group read for Jane Austen July this year was Sense and Sensibility, and I was very excited to dive in. Every year for Jane Austen July, I've been making it my personal goal to read Jane Austen in Spanish. So that has been very interesting the last couple of years. Before we dive into everything that I thought about Sense and Sensibility, I'm going to reach back here to our Booktuber Shoutout book, and we're going to shout out somebody randomly. Today's shout out goes to Rosin's Reading. I will leave a link to their channel in the description. Be sure to go over and subscribe to them. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe to this channel and give this video a thumbs up if you love Jane Austen. And of course, follow me on Goodreads and Storygraph and Instagram and all the places. I've already done a whole nother video comparing two different film adaptations of this book, and reading this book and then also at the same time watching different film adaptations. I feel like I've been exposed to it in just 3 different ways. So be sure to go over and watch that video about the film adaptations. I feel like it kind of gave me a little bit of a different perspective into this story as well. So the main plot of Sense and Sensibility is 2 sisters, Elinor and Marianne, who have very different personalities. Elinor is practical and reserved. Marianne is very emotional and vivacious, and they really struggle to understand one another. But ultimately, they learn from each other. Although the sisters find romance in unexpected places, it is their sisterly relationship that defines them. I've definitely heard a lot of people who read Sense and Sensibility and they don't really care for it, but when they reread it as a book about 2 sisters and their relationship, instead of thinking that it's a romance, then they enjoy it a lot more because the focus is not really the romance. The focus is the 2 sisters and their relationship together. I have always loved stories about siblings, and this book is full of comparisons and contrasts between various groups of siblings. Austen is a genius at weaving a really interesting story with very intense character development and an exploration of different personality traits. You can just tell that Austen must have observed these types of behaviors and character traits in real life, because in her books, they just ring so true. So this time around, reading in Spanish definitely made me read slower because Spanish is my second language. I read a lot slower in Spanish, but that made me think really carefully about each sentence. It was very refreshing to revisit this beloved story, but from a little bit of a new perspective. However, the translation that I had was just a free ebook, and it was full of errors, and that annoyed me quite a bit. So all of Sense and Sensibility really is about siblings. And we see a lot of different pairs of siblings who react in some opposite direction to whatever their sibling is doing. One of the most basic of these is that Marianne does music and Elinor does drawing. I definitely see that in my own group of siblings. I'm the eldest of 4 siblings, and whatever one of us is doing, like this is my hobby and how I identify, the other siblings are like, well, I don't like that. I'm doing something different. It definitely makes me wonder how Jane Austen's siblings probably were like that too. So because Marianne is so expressive with her emotions, then Elinor tends to keep her emotions very close. And contrary-wise, Marianne seems to react even more emotionally because Elinor is just so reserved with her emotions. Marianne doesn't even try to control her emotions. The book literally says that she doesn't even try. She doesn't even make an effort to control the intensity of her emotions. It's just not healthy to be so overwhelmed by either good or bad emotions, to the point where you don't even make an effort to control them, and then your emotions are upsetting everyone around you. Marianne is also rude to people quite often because she has this ideal of like being true to herself. to the point where she won't even be polite to people that she doesn't like because she feels like it would be a betrayal of her true feelings. But Elinor is the opposite. She is so in control of her emotions that when something bad happens to her, to Elinor, she ends up consoling her mother and her sisters instead of being true to her own feelings and expressing her own grief. It's not healthy to be overwhelmed by your emotions, but it's also not healthy to bottle them up. So whereas Marianne takes being true to herself to extremes, to the point where she forgets her duty, she forgets to even be polite to people, Elinor is so untrue to herself because she is obsessed with being polite and doing what she perceives to be her duty. So they are two complete extremes of emotional intelligence. But emotional maturity would be finding a balance. And of course, through the story and through their difficult experiences, the sisters do achieve some emotional maturity. They learn from each other and they kind of meet in the middle. So in this book, we have a lot of characters who are doubles of each other, like their personalities are very similar. And then we have a lot of characters where their personalities are the opposite to each other. And because there are so many other characters who are mirroring this oppositeness, those other characters allow us to explore facets of Elinor and Marianne's oppositeness. Is oppositeness a word? I feel like that's just not grammatically correct, but you know what I'm trying to say. So the doubles in the book are Marianne and her mother. They both have very stormy, emotional personalities. And then Marianne and Willoughby have very similar just foolishness, thoughtlessness. They express themselves very intensely, but they just don't think things through. And Lucy Steele and Fanny Dashwood have very calculating, greedy personalities. And Mrs. Jennings and her daughter, Mrs. Palmer, are both just constantly cheerful. They have the same inane laughter. And then Colonel Brandon and Edward Ferrars are both sort of quiet and reserved, but more in different ways. Brandon is more reserved because he's had a very difficult life, whereas Edward is reserved more from social awkwardness. And Elinor and Brandon are also sort of similar. They're very practical, and they have this selfless wish to just take care of everybody. And of course, just like all of Jane Austen's novels, we have many characters who represent two extremes of some character trait. And in Sense and Sensibility, quite often, these pairs are siblings. So we have the Dashwood sisters, who are all good and selfless and generous, while their brother John is greedy and selfish. We have Lucy Steele and her sister Anne. While Lucy is scheming and very sharp-minded, her sister Anne is just silly and foolish. While Fanny Dashwood and Robert Ferrars are selfish and greedy, their brother Edward is honorable and compassionate. And of course, Mrs. Palmer is just always cheerful, while her sister, Lady Middleton, is always solemn. But often, it's not the siblings that we see so much reacting to each other. Sometimes it's other characters who begin to exhibit oppositeness because they're just reacting to the exuberant behavior of someone by doing the opposite. So Mrs. Jennings and her daughter Charlotte are just extremely happy for no reason. And so Mr. Palmer reacts by being very somber and critical. And Elinor gets the impression that Mr. Palmer wasn't always that way. When Mr. Palmer talks to Elinor and Marianne, he seems more just normal. But as soon as his wife gets involved, he has this reaction where he's just very critical and taciturn, and he's reacting to her craziness. And Sir John Middleton is extremely outgoing and friendly and always wants people around. And so Lady Middleton reacts by being very cold and aloof and really unfriendly, just unpersonable. But of course, the biggest reaction is how Elinor reacts to Marianne's emotional outbursts by doing the opposite. She never allows herself to have an emotional outburst. She must always keep her emotions hidden inside. But this means that she has to cut herself off from any true connection with anyone, even her own family. She is just hidden behind these walls of decorum. This book has so many layers to explore. Every time I read it, I see something new, some new aspect of the characters and how they interact. I never get tired of rereading Jane Austen. So from here on out, there are going to be spoilers for Sense and Sensibility. So if you have not read it yet, then goodbye and come back later once you've read it. So I've already talked about how Marianne and Elinor, they just do not have healthy emotional control either way. So how is it that through the story, then they find that emotional maturity and balance? How is it that they meet in the middle? And how are those journeys for each of them similar to meet in the middle? And how are those journeys different? I've been thinking about this a lot and looking for clues in the narrative that actually tells you what is going on in Marianne's mind and what does Elinor think about this and how is she feeling in that moment? So it's obvious that Marianne is somehow cleansed by her illness. It's definitely said in the book that it's her own fault that she got sick. She was so wrapped up in her wild emotions that she did not take care of her health. And that brush with death is what gives her perspective and the serenity to replace her excessive grief. So she finally makes an effort to control her emotions, to the great relief of everyone involved. But Elinor is cleansed when she hears that Edward is not married. Because it's after she finds out that he is not married that she finally breaks down and cries. And she finally shows her true feelings. This extreme shock of happiness is what unlocks her emotions. So for happy-go-lucky Marianne, it is her serious illness that changes her heart. And for serious Elinor, it is that sudden happiness that changes her heart. Although this is, of course, a book about siblings, there are a lot of other characters who have very clear connections. There are a lot of contrasts and parallels between Willoughby and Edward Ferrars. They're both in similar situations, but they react in very different ways. So both of them are involved with other women before they meet the Dashwood sisters. Now, of course, Edward does the honorable thing, whereas Willoughby abandons Eliza, pregnant and alone. Edward and Willoughby are both poor, dependent on their rich relations. But Edward doesn't care about riches as long as he has a clear conscience. Whereas Willoughby, in debt, is willing to do any atrocity if it means gaining riches because he has no conscience. Edward is constrained by his honor to not act on his feelings for Elinor. But Willoughby does act on his feelings for Marianne because he has no honor. So I think it's really interesting to see these two very different characters. And it's funny how their situations really are quite similar. But of course, the outcome is completely different. So I've been thinking a lot, of course, about which character fits with which character to be their opposite. And I got to thinking about Lucy Steele. Now, the obvious answer is that her opposite is her sister, Anne Steele. Anne is sort of comparable to Marianne, but Anne has those kind of flighty emotions without any sort of education or common sense to rein her in, leaving her on the point of idiocy, really. Whereas Lucy kind of takes Elinor's trait of being reserved and practical, but she takes that to the point of being false and lying and scheming. So there are really these two groups of sisters who take these traits to their extremes. But there's someone else that I sort of noticed has a few things in common with Lucy Steele, and sort of the opposite to Lucy Steele, obviously. And that, oddly enough, is Colonel Brandon. Hear me out, okay? I know it's a little bit weird, Lucy Steele and Colonel Brandon, this does not compute. But I'm telling you, I've been thinking about this. So they are both involved in love triangles with the Dashwoods. They both make Elinor their confidant. Brandon befriends Elinor in order to support her and her family, and of course because of his love for Marianne. And he has a real wish to serve the Dashwood family. He's reliable and kind and generous in every way. He's a true brother to Elinor, even when he has no hope of gaining Marianne's love. However, Lucy befriends Elinor in order to tear down Elinor's hopes, in order to triumph over her. And of course, this is stemming from Lucy's love of herself. Her own selfish desires guide everything she does. And she has to tear others down in order to feel good about herself. She has to gain control over people in some way. You know, she just loved to watch Elinor squirm under the barbs of her words. So I think there's an argument to be made there for Lucy versus Colonel Brandon. But I've also thought that Brandon's opposite is also, in a way, John Dashwood. We have the indifferent brother and then the new supportive brother to Elinor. We see John's greed versus Brandon's generosity. I really love that both Edward Ferrars and Colonel Brandon have really affectionate relationships with their future sister-in-laws before anything in the romance is really settled. So there's definitely a lot to explore in these brotherly relationships as well. So those are some of my thoughts about Sense and Sensibility. Please leave me a comment and let me know who is your favorite character. What connections do you see between opposites or maybe doubles in the character traits that different personalities have? I would love to keep this exploration of their personalities going in the comments. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and remember, the right book in the right hands at the right time can change the world.